Well, since you brought up California-specific policy, can I get your take on the potential broadband infrastructure that the governor's been talking about?
Yeah, I am really, really bullish on this potential broadband infrastructure bill. This is the kind of thing that can really make a difference. Back again to Elon Musk being a charlatan, you know, the other problem Elon Musk has is that physics has a well-known socialist bias. And there is only so much electromagnetic spectrum, which means that if you want to provide the kind of bandwidth that Musk is claiming that he'll give to people, and you want to do it at scale, you need a whole bunch of satellites, and they can't overlap too much, because then they start interfering with each other. And if you just keep like widening the bandwidth and or adding more radio energy to the the connection between the satellites and ground stations, you either end up increasing the amount of interference, you raise the noise floor and you make it harder for individual satellites to communicate with ground stations, or you increase the amount of ambient radio energy in the sky so to such an extent that like birds start falling out of the sky pre-cooked, right? So there are some like really hard limits on what we can do with satellites, and the math doesn't add up for what Musk is promising. Meanwhile, fiber is seriously future-proofed. The baseline for a strand of fiber is 100 gigabits, and it gets faster from that. And if you pull conduit, then it gets faster still, because now what you can do is, instead of dropping a single fiber down in the ground and then having to dig it all up again if you need a second fiber, you have a pipe, and you can fish a lot of fiber through that pipe. You can fish a braided rope of fiber as thick as a baby's arm through that pipe. And now you've got the kind of bandwidth that might see us through, really to the middle of the next century. And one of the things that we know from American history and from the history of all like widely dispersed countries is that when you provide these utilities universally, the way we did, say, with electrification or roads, you completely transform the character of communities, and you completely transform the sense of cohesion among the communities. There's a lot of data right now about how badly people have fared because they lived in broadband deserts during the pandemic, during the lockdown, because they couldn't access things. And those broadband deserts, they didn't occur merely because it was uneconomical to reach those towns or those remote places. They occurred because the disorderliness of the monopolized market for telecoms sort of doomed them. One of the things that happened pretty early in the pandemic is that Frontier, which was, I think, arguably like the second worst cable operator in America.
Well, when you go into those weeds, you can get lost really quick. Because I've had that discussion amidst like other friends who work for digital rights organizations, where it's like, well, who actually is the worst?
So Frontier, the thing about the Frontier that made them so especially bad is, as the other major carriers were monopolizing, were buying up all the regionals, they were often forced by the FTC or the DOJ to sell off some kind of remote holdings that they had, some remote franchises that they had. And Frontier went around and gobbled them all up from like Verizon and AT&T. They bought all these little out-of-the-way franchises for places that were remote, rural, marginalized, disadvantaged, declining, right? Places that were already like at coming up from behind and who needed a boost. And Frontier, like most large corporations, paid its executive ranks primarily in stock and only secondarily in cash. And that made their executives extremely beholden to Wall Street analysts, because if a Wall Street analyst nixes a plan that you've made, then your stock goes down and you can't afford to pay your mortgage or, buy another swimming pool or like buy your kid a horse or whatever it is CEOs do, right? And so one of the things that we learned when Frontier went bankrupt and it had to publish its financials, its internals, is that they had a plan to profitably connect 1 million households to 100 gigabit fiber for a $1 billion investment that would yield an $800 million investment over a 10-year amortization period. So in other words, they had an $800 million payday waiting for them, and they had access to the capital to build it. But they deliberately chose to leave those families on some of the worst copper infrastructure in the country. Like literally, you see photos of Frontier infrastructure, and it's copper wires wrapped in newspaper, dipped in tar, and draped over shrubs. And they decided not to upgrade those families because Wall Street analysts don't like CapEx that amortizes over more than 5 years. So the analysts who controlled their share price would have downrated their stock if they had made a profitable investment that would have yielded $800 million. And then they doomed a million, oh, I beg your pardon, it was 3 million families to this old copper infrastructure. We also learned that they had 1 million families that they understood to have no alternative. So these were places where there wasn't a cable operator to create a duopoly, where there was only a DSL monopoly. And they booked those internally as assets because they understood that those customers could not choose to go somewhere else. And so irrespective of how much they charged and irrespective of how unreliable and slow their service was, they could keep those customers, right? So you know, this issue about remote places not having broadband, it's not merely about whether it's profitable. It's about this wildly distorted and monopolized market, a kind of naturally monopolized market, right? Because generally speaking, if one company lays the mid-haul and long-haul and then local infrastructure for telecoms, no one else is going to invest in doing it. And so that's one of the reasons that in many parts of the world, you have a firm that is either a government spinoff or a government public-private partnership or a regulated monopoly that does that infrastructure, and then other firms operate service on top of it as a way of creating markets in the places where a market can function, and we don't leave to the market those places that produce natural monopolies.
Yeah, you know, the way I like to kind of break it down when I talk about these issues on my show is, look, I don't have the tech acumen to explain how exactly we build broadband, but I know that it's not some unattainable feat. When you hear these stories, I mean, hey, over in the UK, there was that group of farmers. They weren't happy with what was available to them. They laid their own fiber and built this like top-notch network. So it can be done. We just have more or less, I think an organized duopoly is a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
It is basically what our cable arrangement is. And they're focused on profit. So they just, you know, they look at a community and if they feel like they're not going to get the margins they want to see, they just don't invest there.
But they also collude to underinvest, right?
Oh,
so
totally.
if one doesn't invest, the other one doesn't have to invest. And so they have these cozy arrangements. You saw this with Frontier and Verizon in New York City, where at one point, not Frontier, I beg your pardon, Spectrum Charter. At one point, Spectrum Charter actually was kicked out of New York State altogether by the regulator for its egregious falsehoods, underinvestment, and failure to supply the service that was mandated. So, you know, I live in Burbank, and Burbank is like it's a 100,000 person autonomous municipal entity that's right up against Hollywood. Like I can see North Hollywood from my front door, and it gives us kind of the best of all worlds. We have North Hollywood over there, and we have our own political unit over here. And generally it's pretty functional, but one place where it's really busted is in fiber. So Burbank had a really visionary idea. They floated a municipal bond and they built out 100 gigabit fiber network, and it serves the large businesses, the airport, Disney, Warner, Universal.
It's not really residential though at this point, is it?
So that's where I was headed. It runs under the foundation slab I'm sitting on, and I'm not connected to it, because we have done a deal with Charter where they have the exclusive remit to terminate broadband connections on residential premises. So even though I have a business and I pay for a business license, and these are because this is zoned as a private home, I cannot get broadband from the fiber that my municipal taxes pay for, right? Like, because the coupon on that bond comes out of our municipal taxes. So we pay we're still amortizing that investment, but we're not accessing that investment. And, you know, if you believe that businesses or the government should run like a business, this makes no sense. If you believe the government should run for the public good, this makes no sense.
Right.
This makes no sense, right? Like this is incoherent no matter where you are on the political spectrum. And so, you know, and I think that local politicians really underestimate the extent to which broadband is a vote getter. Like, I understand that if you go to the doorstep and you say, you know, I'm going to give you broadband, people will be like, oh, that's nice. I hate my cable operator. But if you could actually deliver it, right? Like the massive change in the way people live when they have symmetrical 100 gigabit.
Go talk to people in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Yeah, yeah. Or, you know, there's a county in Pennsylvania that it's the poorest white majority county in the world, or in the country rather. It's an Appalachian county where they got some Fed money, and they built out a municipal fiber network using the corporate infrastructure left behind by their old New Deal era electrification and telephone co-op.
Really? I'm not familiar with that one. I gotta look. I'm from Pennsylvania. I gotta look that up.
They pulled fiber. It's Kentucky-Pennsylvania border. So they pulled fiber to every house in the county, including places at the tops of mountains. And they used a mule called Old Bub to pull fiber up mountain passes that were inaccessible by motorized vehicles. And they put fiber in every premise in the county. And the median wage shot up to $25 an hour because they got all kinds of telework, right? There are entire upper middle class communities in China whose children are learning to speak English with thick Appalachian accents because that's where they're doing language classes remotely.
You don't remember the name of the county? I gotta look this up.
I'll look it up. I'll find, if you Google Old Bub Fiber, OLEBUB, Fiber Appalachia, it will be easy enough to find.
Yeah, I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I'm surprised. I mean, you know, like I try to follow all of this the best I can. I mean, I follow the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, and I follow, you know, and I know like you know, in Charlemont, Massachusetts, they set Comcast packing. They were like, yeah, we see what you're offering. We're gonna say no thanks and do this ourselves. And that's why I always tell people, I'm like, look, it's not a one size fits all thing. This could be done in a town of 7,000 or Los Angeles. Yeah, like it's not. And I it's cool. It's interesting you bring up Burbank. I used to live in Pasadena. You know, I live in San Pedro now, and I presented on municipal broadband at a city hall meeting. Like I just showed up and I was like, we should have municipal broadband. And, you know, I just kind of gave a spiel about it. And there were enough people that were for it that they put it on a city agenda. And, you know, to their credit, they conducted this study, but it was a bit limited. And they came back and they said, well, Beverly Hills is building a fiber to the home thing. This is how much that is going to cost them. We multiplied it by the mileage of Pasadena, decided we can't afford this. And Burbank tried to do something, but it's only for businesses. And sorry, we can't afford this. And that was it. And so, you know, I kind of made the case. I'm like, look, this is a very limited case study here. I appreciate you doing it, but I think we got to keep the conversation going.
And a ton of that is just bookkeeping, right? So, you know, when you talk about rights of way or road disruption, a lot of those are pro forma numbers, right? So obviously the city doesn't have to pay the city when the city takes over one of the city streets to dig it up, and, you know, they have to pay the city workers, but the license fee that a utility might pay to block off your street and dig a trench to stick fiber in it is not is like, even if they have a pro forma accounting convention where the city bills itself for that, all that's happening is money is moving from one city account to the other. And rights of way and licensing, those are a huge piece of the overall cost here. So generally speaking, if a city wants to show that it's not economically viable, it's not hard to do that. But it just is an accounting fiction rather than an actual hard constraint.
Yeah. In other words, we can afford it if we want it. If we really want to do this,
we can have nice things. We can have nice things. To say nothing of the economic opportunity, you know, like so back to the pandemic, you know, the number of editors, sound editors, SFX people, and so on, who after a couple of weeks into the pandemic, when it became clear they weren't going back into their offices, went to the office and brought home their render station and started editing from there, only to discover that they couldn't move assets back and forth to the studio because they had throttled upstream, right? Because they had copper infrastructure that just doesn't support high-speed uploads. It kneecapped the studios and to a much greater extent, the supply chain of the studios, the independent firms that are all up and down, you know, Olive Street and Burbank Boulevard and so on, that do effects, sound, and so on, who really rely on that high-speed broadband and who couldn't, you know, do what they used to do, which is have their editors come in on site and then, you know, in extremis, just like drive a hard drive down the block to you know, the gates of Warner or Disney.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting, and like you're saying, it's like you can argue it from any political perspective too, should
Sure.
you choose to. Like I talk about municipal broadband, I'm like, look, I'm a very left-wing guy, but this is not a left-wing or a right-wing issue. You
Oh,
can argue
totally.
it from any perspective.
Oh, yeah.
And there was that mini documentary that came out recently about that small town in North Carolina who was talking about like, hey, the internet's a utility in our life. We need to treat it like one. This is like back in the day when only so many people had electricity. You know, they're saying the same things folks like you and I are saying. And it's like the country. Well, let me ask you one other question on this topic.
Sure.
Does the California, the infrastructure proposal, does it prioritize municipal building?
So what it is it builds out the middle haul. So it does the interurban links, and then it creates pools of patient capital. So very low interest borrowing pools that amortize over 40 years, along with expertise banks. So your local town can borrow all the money it needs to do the local rollout, amortized over 40 years at low interest from a loan from the state, because the state's got access to a lot of capital right now. Mm-hmm. And then they also get state level expertise to help them figure out how to plan their rollout and maintain their rollout and train local people to maintain the rollout. So, you know, when you live in like a city in the valley or you know, on the coast, it's not going to be hard for you to find people who can operate your local network. But if you live in a real small town out in the, you know, Central Valley, agricultural town, there may not be anyone there right now who knows how to do it, but it's not like those people are stupid, right? They just need some training. And so it will provide the training, and it'll provide the infrastructure, and it'll provide the procedures and so on to help them do it. So this is exactly how electrification rolled out. So I wanted to mention one other thing, because you were talking about the bipartisan nature of broadband. I think that the greatest self-own that the American right ever experienced was blocking municipal and state fiber initiatives. Because the reason we don't have municipal and state fiber is not that it's like a hard case to make. It's that ALEC promulgated model legislation to a bunch of states that the states then enacted that banned cities from building out fiber with public money. So that you know, you could have these duopolists that would operate instead and gouge people. And today you have the same people who kind of briefed for that complaining about big tech and deplatforming. And you know what? Like, I was complaining about big tech and deplatforming back when it was trans activists and sex workers who didn't want to use their real name and pipeline activists and so on. Like, deplatforming is an actual problem. Like, we don't want one company deciding who gets to participate in our public discourse, because I guarantee you, if you are progressive, you are not going to be on the same side as that company 99.999% of the time. Right. You know, the fact that they got rid of Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos is not much comfort when you think about all the people whose names you don't know because they got kicked off years and years ago.
Well, so we're seeing that right now with all these Palestinian rights pages.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, yeah, and everyone, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, right? Your political clout translates directly to your ability to resist deplatforming or moderation or content removal, and you know, the people progressives care about by definition don't have a lot of political clout. So you know, that's always going to be a problem. But you know what? If you had 100 gigabit fiber drop in your garage, you wouldn't need all these other services to host your, you know, weird COVID denial forum. You could just stick a cheap ass server in your garage and host you and 50,000 friends on it pretty straightforwardly, right? Like the main reason we have these vast content distribution networks is because broadband is concentrated into a few big data interchanges and a few data centers. There is a lot of stuff at the mid scale, right? Not Facebook scale, but like at the mid scale, where you could run a significant amount of service out of a very modest investment in hardware and expertise, particularly because so much of that infrastructure can be remotely managed. So you can install the hardware, and then you could hire remote admins to manage the hardware and lock it down for you and so on. It wouldn't solve all of their problems, and some of them would get hacked and some of their servers would fall over and so on. But you know, the funneling of all of our connectivity into a few places really did set up this infrastructure where we're going to have these gatekeepers. And, you know, like, I think it probably was a reasonably safe bet on the part of people who represent the interests of wealthy, powerful people that gatekeepers would be on their side, but not always, right? Not always. And, you know, don't act surprised when they're not on your side and you find that there's no way around the gatekeepers, because that's the system you created.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and